They called him crazy. A grease-stained mechanic with calloused hands and impossible dreams, standing in a naval hangar surrounded by pilots who wouldn't last another month in the sky. But what Jack Holloway saw in that radial engine wasn't madness. It was mathematics, physics, and something the war colleges would never teach: desperation forged into genius. In 6 weeks, his ridiculous modification would rewrite the Pacific Theater. In 6 weeks, zeros would fall from the sky like autumn leaves. But tonight, with his wrench trembling in his grip and the weight of 10,000 lives on his shoulders, Jack Holloway had no idea he was about to become the most important man nobody would ever remember. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Hangar 7, Naval Air Station Kaului, Maui. April 1943. The air tasted of aviation fuel and salt spray, thick enough to choke on. Jack Holloway wiped his hands on his leather apron, leaving dark streaks across the already stained surface, and stared at the Grumman F-6F Hellcat before him like a sculptor examining unfinished marble. "You're wasting your time, Holloway." Commander Preston Walsh stood in the hangar entrance, his uniform crisp despite the humidity that turned everyone else into sweat-soaked shadows. "That bird flies exactly how Grumman designed it to fly." Jack didn't look up. His fingers traced the cowling of the R-2800 double wasp engine, feeling the rivets, the seams, the weight distribution that every other mechanic accepted as gospel. "Grumman designed it to survive, sir. Not to hunt. Survive is what we need. We're losing 3 pilots for every zero we bring down." Walsh's voice carried the hollow timbre of a man who'd written too many letters to mothers. "The Wildcat was a death trap. The Hellcat is our answer. The Hellcat is a brick with wings." Jack finally turned, and there was no disrespect in his eyes, only the certainty of someone who'd done the mathematics in grease pencil on every flat surface in the hangar. 1,800 pounds heavier than a zero. "The Mitsubishi can turn inside us, climb faster, and by the time our boys realize they're in a dogfight, they're already dead." Walsh stepped closer, his shadow falling across the workbench scattered with tools, blueprints, and a half-eaten sandwich from yesterday. "Then what's your solution, Ironmaster?" The nickname wasn't affectionate. Jack had earned it through 12-hour shifts, burned hands, and an obsession with metal that made the other mechanics nervous. He saw aircraft not as machines but as extensions of physics, waiting to be optimized, pushed, perfected. "We make it lighter and meaner." Jack grabbed a schematic, his pencil moving faster than thought. "Strip 90 pounds from the armor plating here, here, and here. Relocate the oil cooler intake. Modify the exhaust stacks for thrust augmentation. Adjust the propeller pitch mechanism." "You want to remove armor? During a war?" Walsh's laugh was bitter. "You'll kill them faster than the Japanese." "The armor doesn't save them, Commander. Speed does. Maneuverability does." Jack's pencil kept moving, his mind 3 steps ahead of his hands. "A Hellcat that can outturn a zero changes everything. They won't be running anymore. They'll be hunting." Walsh studied the schematic, his jaw tight. Behind them, 3 other mechanics had stopped working, drawn by the conversation like moths to flame. Billy Chen, barely 19, fresh from San Francisco. Tom Wrench Morrison, 42, who'd built cars before Pearl Harbor. Sarah Vance, the only female mechanic on the island, who could outwork any man in the hangar and proved it daily. "It's impossible," Walsh said finally. "Grumman engineers spent 2 years developing this aircraft. And I've spent 10 months watching their aircraft fall out of the sky." Jack's voice didn't rise, but something in it made Walsh flinch. "Every modification I'm proposing? I've already tested the math. I've already run the simulations on paper. I need 3 weeks and a single aircraft. Give me that, and I'll give you a fighter that makes zeros think twice about showing up." The hangar fell silent except for the distant rumble of waves against the shore. Walsh looked at the Hellcat, at Jack, at the schematic covered in numbers and vectors, and the desperate handwriting of a man who'd found an answer everyone else had missed. "You get 2 weeks, Walsh said. "And if Lieutenant Commander Hayes's squadron wipes out because your modifications failed, I'll have you court-martialed for negligence." Jack nodded once. "Fair enough, sir." Walsh left, his footsteps echoing against concrete. The moment he disappeared, Sarah approached, her coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid. "You really think this'll work?" "I don't think. I calculate." Jack picked up his wrench, feeling its familiar weight. "But yeah, it'll work." Billy Chin whistled low. "You just bet your career on some stripped armor and relocated plumbing." "I bet my career on physics." Jack moved to the Hellcat's engine cowling, already visualizing the disassembly process. "Help me get this bird apart before I change my mind." They worked through the night. 14 hours straight, fueled by coffee that tasted like motor oil and sandwiches from the mess hall that arrived cold and left colder. Jack's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, removing panels, unbolting components, exposing the Hellcat skeleton to the harsh hangar lights. The other mechanics drifted over throughout the shift, curious, skeptical, some openly hostile. Nobody modified naval aircraft without approval from 3 layers of bureaucracy and an engineer's stamp. What Jack was doing wasn't just unorthodox. It was career suicide. "You're gonna get someone killed," muttered Frank Delaney, a mechanic who'd been stateside until last month. "These birds are tested to military specifications." Jack didn't pause in his work, his wrench turning with mechanical rhythm. "Military specifications are written for average conditions by average engineers. This isn't Kansas, Frank. This is the Pacific, where the enemy aircraft can outmaneuver us in every measurable category except straight-line speed and structural durability. And if you can't catch them, durability doesn't matter." "Listen to the Ironmaster," Frank sneered. "Thinks he's smarter than Grumman." "I don't think I'm smarter than Grumman." Jack finally stopped, meeting Frank's eyes across the exposed engine. "I think I'm more desperate. Because I watched 8 pilots die last week, and I'm tired of writing names on fuselages only to paint them over with fresh aluminum 3 days later." Frank didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. The tally of losses hung over the airfield like smoke, visible, choking, inescapable. By dawn, the Hellcat looked gutted. Armor panels lay stacked against the hangar wall, each piece carefully labeled. The oil cooler system sprawled across 2 workbenches, its components cleaned and prepared for relocation. Jack's hands were bleeding from a dozen small cuts, but he didn't seem to notice. "Get some sleep," Sarah said, appearing at his elbow with fresh coffee. "You've been up 30 hours. Sleep when it flies." Jack accepted the coffee, his eyes never leaving the aircraft. 3 more days to reassemble. 4 days for test flights. Then we prove it works or prove I'm an idiot. "Could be both," Tom Morrison said, but he was smiling. He'd been watching Jack work with the appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship. "You need help with the propeller mechanism?" "Yeah. Thanks." They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only develops between people who speak through tools and metal rather than words. Outside, the sun climbed higher, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and blood. Somewhere out there, across those beautiful, treacherous waters, Japanese pilots were climbing into their Zeros, running through pre-flight checks, preparing for another day of hunting American aircraft like game birds. Jack tightened a bolt and thought about physics. About lift-to-drag ratios and power-to-weight distributions. About the moment a pilot realizes he's outmatched and the 3 seconds of terror before impact. About his younger brother, Michael, who died over the Coral Sea in a Wildcat that couldn't turn fast enough to matter. "This one's for you, Mike," Jack whispered, too quiet for anyone to hear. The week blurred into a continuous cycle of work, inspection, and modification. Jack slept in 4-hour increments on a cot in the corner of the hangar, dreaming in blueprints and waking with solutions to problems he'd been wrestling with for months. The Hellcat slowly reassembled itself under his hands, transformed from standard naval fighter into something leaner, meaner, purpose-built for the specific hell of Pacific air combat. Commander Walsh appeared daily, saying nothing, just watching with the expression of a man who'd invested in a long shot and couldn't decide if he was brave or stupid. Other officers came too. Word had spread about the crazy mechanic who was butchering a perfectly good Hellcat on a theory and a prayer. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes showed up on day 9. He was 31, ancient by fighter pilot standards, with eyes that had seen too much sky and too many friends spiral into the ocean. His squadron, the Widowmakers, had lost 15 pilots in 3 months. The survivors flew with the desperation of men who knew their number was coming up. Holloway. Hayes stopped in front of the Hellcat, hands on his hips. Walsh says you're building me a miracle. Jack didn't pause in his work, adjusting the modified exhaust stack. I'm building you a fighter that won't get you killed in the first 30 seconds of contact. That's a low bar. It's a realistic bar. Jack finally looked at him. Current doctrine says run from zeros unless you have altitude and speed advantage. I'm giving you an aircraft that can stand and fight. Hayes circled the Hellcat slowly, his pilot's eye cataloging every modification. You stripped the armor. 90 pounds from non-critical areas. The protection you need is speed and maneuverability, not steel plates that add drag. Modified the engine cowling. Better cooling efficiency, reduced frontal area, improved aerodynamics. Changed the exhaust configuration. Thrust augmentation. You'll get an extra 15 horsepower from the same engine. Hayes completed his circle, his expression unreadable. If this works, I'll buy you a drink. If it fails and I survive, I'll punch you in the mouth. Fair deal. Jack extended a grease-stained hand. Hayes shook it. When's the test flight? Tomorrow at dawn. You'll be the pilot. Hayes blinked. Walsh approved that? Walsh doesn't know yet. Jack's smile was thin. But you're the best pilot in the squadron, and if this bird's going to prove itself, it needs someone who can actually push it to the limit. You're either brilliant or insane. Most likely both. Hayes laughed, genuine, surprised laughter that rang through the hangar. Tomorrow at dawn, Ironmaster. Don't make me regret this. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot, staring at the hangar ceiling, running through every calculation one more time. The mathematics was sound. The modifications were precise. But mathematics didn't account for the chaos of combat, for the split-second decisions that separated life from death at 300 miles per hour. He thought about his brother again. Michael had been 22, cocky, brilliant in the cockpit, limited by an aircraft that couldn't match his skill. The Wildcat had been tough, but tough didn't matter when you couldn't catch the enemy and couldn't outmaneuver them once you did. This has to work, Jack whispered to the darkness. Dawn came cold and clean, the Pacific stretching to the horizon like hammered silver. Jack stood on the tarmac, his clipboard forgotten in his hand, as Hayes performed his pre-flight inspection. The modified Hellcat gleamed in the early light, beautiful and deadly, every line purposeful. Commander Walsh appeared, his face thunderous. Holloway. My office. Now. After the test flight, sir. I didn't authorize. I know, sir. But it's too late now. Jack nodded toward Hayes, who was already climbing into the cockpit. Either it works or it doesn't. We'll know in 20 minutes. Walsh's jaw worked, but he didn't order Hayes down. They both knew the same truth. Desperate times didn't just allow desperate measures. They demanded them. The ART 2800 engine roared to life, that distinctive double wasp growl that made the ground shake. Hayes taxied to the runway, and Jack could see his hand resting on the throttle through the canopy. A quick salute. Then full throttle, the Hellcat accelerating down the runway faster than any stock model, lifting off with authority that made Jack's heart soar. Come on, he breathed. Show them what you can do. Hayes climbed fast, turning into the morning sun. Jack tracked him through binoculars, watching the flight characteristics, the way the aircraft responded to control inputs. Tighter turns. Faster rolls. The reduced weight and improved aerodynamics were evident in every maneuver. Then Hayes pushed it harder. A vertical climb that would have stalled a stock Hellcat. A series of snap rolls that tested structural integrity. A high-speed dive that brought him screaming back toward the airfield before pulling up in a loop so tight that it should have been impossible. The Hellcat danced. That was the only word for it. Where the standard model was a hammer, this was a rapier, precise, deadly, controlled. Jack watched Hayes put the aircraft through maneuvers that zero pilots thought they owned, and felt something unclench in his chest. It worked. Against every doubt, every regulation, every voice that said it was impossible, It worked. Hayes brought the Hellcat in for a landing that was pure silk, touching down exactly where he wanted, rolling to a stop near the hangar. The engine cut, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then Hayes was climbing out, pulling off his helmet, and Jack saw it in his eyes, the look of a hunter who just found the weapon he'd been searching for. Holy hell, Holloway! Hayes jumped down from the wing, practically running across the tarmac. That thing turns inside a zero. I pushed it to 7G turns and it didn't even complain. The roll rate is 50% faster. And the acceleration? Jesus, the acceleration felt like someone strapped a rocket to a normal Hellcat. Walsh stepped forward, his expression still stormy but with something else underneath. Maybe. Or fear of hope. It's that good. It's that good, sir. Hayes was breathing hard, adrenaline still pumping. With 6 of these I could hold off 20 zeros. With a full squadron. He looked at Jack. We'd own the sky. Jack allowed himself one moment of relief. One breath where the weight lifted. Then he was back to business. We need to build 17 more. 3 weeks if we work around the clock. You don't have 3 weeks. Walsh's voice cut through the celebration. Admiral Spruance is launching Operation Vengeance in 16 days. Every fighter in the fleet is committed. And the Japanese are sending their best, the Tainan Air Group. 0 pilots with hundreds of combat hours each. The name hung in the air like a curse. The Tainan Air Group had destroyed entire squadrons, their kill ratios so lopsided they seemed fictional. They didn't just win fights. They made American pilots disappear. Then we work faster. Jack's mind was already racing ahead, calculating workflows, delegating tasks. Sarah, Tom, Billy, I need you full-time. Frank, I need you too, even if you think I'm crazy. Commander, I need authorization to pull every mechanic you can spare. Walsh looked at Hayes, at the modified Hellcat, at Jack. You're asking me to bet the operation on your modifications. I'm asking you to bet on physics, sir. And on the men who have to fly these birds into combat. Jack met his eyes. You've already lost how many pilots this month? Walsh flinched. 23. Then what do you have to lose? For a long moment, Walsh didn't answer. Then, everything. But you're right, we're losing everything anyway. Turn to Hayes. Get your squadron ready. They're all getting modified Hellcats. To Jack, you've got 16 days, Ironmaster. Don't waste them. What followed was a blur of motion that Jack would remember only in fragments. The hangar transformed into a production line, 8 mechanics working simultaneously on different aircraft, each one stripped, modified, and reassembled with precision that bordered on obsession. Jack moved between workstations like a conductor, solving problems before they became critical, his clipboard covered in calculations and schedules that evolved hourly. Sarah proved invaluable, her small hands and sharp mind perfect for the delicate work of relocating oil coolers. Tom handled the engine modifications with the confidence of someone who'd been inside radial engines before Jack was born. Billy learned fast, his youth translated into energy that kept him moving when others flagged. Even Frank came around, his skepticism melting as he saw the modifications work on aircraft after aircraft. I still think you're crazy, he told Jack on day 7, both of them elbow-deep in a cowling assembly. But maybe crazy's what we need. They worked 18-hour days. Slept in the hangar. Ate at their workbenches. The airfield CO tried to enforce rest periods and Jack ignored him, until Walsh intervened and told everyone to leave the Ironmaster alone. Rumors spread across the base. The crazy mechanic who was either going to win the war or get a squadron killed. Hayes's pilots came to watch, these young men with old eyes, studying their aircraft like students before an exam. Jack learned their names, their faces, tried not to think about statistics and probabilities. Lieutenant James Rabbit Sullivan, 24, from Nebraska. Ensign Paul Rodriguez, 19, still writing letters home that started with, "Don't worry, Mum." Lieutenant J.G. Thomas Brennan, 30, who'd been an accountant and still calculated odds he no longer shared with anyone. Will it make a difference? Rabbit asked on day 12, watching his Hellcat receive its modifications. Jack paused, wrench in hand, and chose honesty. If you fly smart and use the advantages we've given you? If you try to dogfight stupid? No aircraft can save you. Fair enough. Rabbit touched the fuselage gently, the way you'd touch something precious. Thanks, Ironmaster. By day 14, they'd modified 16 Hellcats. Jack's hands were destroyed. Cuts, burns, bruises that had bruises. He'd lost 12 pounds. His vision occasionally doubled from exhaustion. But the aircraft were ready, lined up on the tarmac like knights awaiting their riders. Walsh inspected each one personally, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he found Jack working on the 17th aircraft, still moving despite looking like death warmed over. Holloway. Stop. Almost done. That's an order, mechanic. You've done enough. Walsh's voice was gentler than Jack had ever heard it. Go sleep. We'll finish this one. Jack wanted to argue, but his body betrayed him, swaying where he stood. Sarah and Tom caught his arms before he fell. 6 hours, Walsh said. Then you can come back and obsess some more. But right now, you're useless to everyone. Jack nodded, too tired to fight. They led him to the barracks, poured him onto a bunk, and he was unconscious before they left the room. He dreamed of aircraft falling from the sky like burning stars. Operation Vengeance launched at dawn on day 16. Jack stood on the observation tower, binoculars in hand, watching the modified Hellcats take off in flights of 4. 18 aircraft total, the 16 modified fighters and 2 standard Hellcats for comparison, though Jack knew those pilots were going to feel like they were flying anvils. Hayes's voice crackled over the radio, calm despite what was coming. Widowmaker lead to base. All birds airborne and systems green. Proceeding to intercept point. The Japanese were coming with 40 zeros, according to intelligence. 2-to-1 odds, except the odds didn't account for the modifications, for Jack's mathematics made metal, for the desperation of men who'd been losing for too long. They'll be fine, Sarah said, appearing beside Jack. She didn't sound convinced. They'll be better than fine. Jack hoped he sounded more certain than he felt. We gave them the tools. Now it's up to them. The minutes crawled past. Jack imagined the flight, the formations converging, the moment when enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon and every pilot's heartbeat tripled. He'd done everything he could. The mathematics was sound. The modifications were perfect. But combat wasn't mathematics. Combat was chaos, skill, and luck measured in milliseconds. The radio crackled. Contact. Multiple bogeys, 11 o'clock high. Jack's hands tightened on the binoculars, though he could see nothing from this distance. Only sky and ocean and the terrible waiting. Hayes's voice, sharp with adrenaline. All units, break by sections. Remember your training. Use your speed. Use your turns. Let's show them what we've got. Then the chatter exploded. Call signs shouting. Position reports. Warnings. The controlled chaos of aerial combat, translated through static and distance. Rabbits on your 6, lead. I see him. Braking right. Holy hell, this thing turns. Splash 1. Splash 1. 0 going down. Jack's breath caught. First kill. Someone was already proving the modifications worked. 2 more, 9 o'clock level. I've got them. Rodriguez, cover my dive. Copy, braking. Wait, they can't follow. They can't follow my turn rate. More voices, overlapping, excited, disbelieving. The pilots were discovering what Jack had calculated, what Hayes had felt in the test flight. The modified Hellcats could fight zeros on their own terms. Could outturn them. Could chase them down. Splash 2. Splash 3. Where'd they all go? Command, we've lost visual on enemy aircraft. Walsh appeared in the tower, his face tense. What's happening? They're winning, sir. Jack's voice was hollow with disbelief. They're actually winning. The radio chatter continued, but the tone had changed. Confusion from the American pilots, uncertainty about where the vaunted Tynon Air Group had disappeared to. Then Hayes's voice, calm and almost amused. Command, Widowmaker lead. Enemy aircraft are withdrawing. Repeat, enemy withdrawal. We have 10 confirmed kills, 3 probables and 0, I say again, 0, friendly losses. Silence in the tower. Then chaos, officers shouting, someone laughing, Sarah grabbing Jack's arm hard enough to bruise. Walsh just stared at the radio like it had spoken in tongues. Did he just say, 10 kills, no losses? Jack felt something break open in his chest, something that might have been laughter or tears or both. It worked. It actually worked. The Hellcats returned in formation, triumphant, bullet holes in wings and fuselages, but every pilot alive. They landed to cheering from the ground crew, and when Hayes climbed out of his cockpit, he was grinning like a madman. Ironmaster. He ran across the tarmac, grabbed Jack in a hug that lifted him off his feet. You magnificent bastard. They couldn't touch us. We turned inside them, we climbed with them, we owned them. The other pilots swarmed over, all talking at once, their voices high with adrenaline and the intoxicating realization that they'd survived. That they'd won. That they had weapons now instead of targets painted on their backs. The look on their faces when we matched their turn rate. I chased one down in a dive and he couldn't shake me. My bird took hits and kept flying like nothing happened. Walsh stood apart, watching, and Jack saw him wipe his eyes quickly. How many letters had Walsh written? How many friends had he lost? And now, finally, something had changed. We need more, Walsh said, approaching Jack through the celebration. Every fighter in the Pacific Fleet needs these modifications. Every single one. That's going to take months, sir. Then we start today. Walsh extended his hand. I was wrong about you, Holloway. You're not crazy. You're exactly what we needed. Jack shook his hand, and felt the weight of exhaustion finally catch up. But before it could pull him under, Hayes appeared with a bottle of whiskey somehow procured from God knew where. I promised you a drink, Ironmaster. Hayes poured 2 glasses, handed one to Jack. To the man who taught Hellcats how to hunt. They drank, and the whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn. The burn of still being alive. The matching. Of taking one small piece of metal and mathematics and desperate inspiration and changing the shape of the war. The celebration continued into the night. But Jack eventually slipped away, walking back to the hangar where the 17th Hellcat waited, still unfinished. He picked up his wrench, felt its familiar weight, and got back to work. Because this was only the beginning. One successful engagement. One battle. The war stretched ahead like a dark ocean, and there would be other fights, other challenges, other desperate measures needed. But for tonight, in this moment, they'd won. They'd proven that innovation born from desperation could overcome superior numbers. That a grease-stained mechanic with impossible ideas could save lives that the engineers had written off. Jack tightened a bolt and thought about his brother. About Michael, who would never know how his death had driven Jack to this moment. How grief had transformed into mathematics and mathematics into salvation. We got one for you, Mike, Jack whispered. And we're going to get a lot more. The wrench turned. The bolt tightened. And in the darkness of the hangar, surrounded by metal and oil and the ghost of dreams, Jack Holloway kept building. 3 months later, the modified Hellcats had achieved a kill ratio of 19-1 against 0 fighters. The Japanese, who'd owned the Pacific skies for 2 years, found themselves suddenly outmatched, outmaneuvered, outgunned by American fighters they'd once considered inferior. The Tainan Air Group, the most feared fighter unit in the Imperial Japanese Navy, was decimated in a series of engagements where the Americans lost 4 pilots and the Japanese lost 47. The psychological impact was devastating. 0 pilots, who'd grown accustomed to aerial superiority, now hesitated before engaging Hellcats. Some refused combat entirely when they recognized the modified silhouettes. Jack's modifications spread across the Pacific Fleet like wildfire. Every carrier, every airfield, every squadron demanded the Holloway modifications, though Brass tried to rename them the Pacific Enhancement Package to make them sound more official. The pilots didn't care. They called them Ironmaster Hellcats, and flew them with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Hayes' squadron, the Widowmakers, became legendary. By war's end, they'd accumulated 267 confirmed kills without losing a single pilot to enemy aircraft. Hayes himself scored 33 victories and wrote in his after-action reports, again and again, Aircraft performance exceeded all expectations. Recommend immediate adoption of modifications fleet-wide. But Jack didn't stay to watch his legacy unfold. A week after Operation Vengeance, orders came through, report to Naval Air Engineering Center, Philadelphia. They wanted him designing aircraft, not just modifying them. Wanted his mind applied to the next generation of fighters. "You're leaving?" Sarah asked, her voice flat with disappointment. "They're transferring me stateside." Jack looked around the hangar, at the workbenches he'd worn smooth with countless hours, at the tools that felt like extensions of his hands. "Someone else will take over here. It won't be the same." "No. But it'll be better." Jack managed to smile. "You learned everything I know. Tom learned everything I know. You'll keep these birds flying, keep these pilots alive. That's what matters." Hayes threw Jack a farewell party that the Admiral pretended not to know about, though everyone saw him slip into the hangar for a drink. The pilots lined up to shake Jack's hand, these men he'd saved without ever firing a shot, without ever leaving the ground. "Thanks, Ironmaster," they said, one after another. "Thanks for bringing us home." Jack boarded a transport plane on a humid morning, his duffel bag light, his hands still stained with grease that no amount of soap would ever completely remove. As the plane climbed, he looked down at the airfield, at the Hellcats lined up like sentinels, and felt something settle in his chest. He'd come to the Pacific broken by his brother's death, driven by rage and grief and the desperate need to make that loss mean something. He'd stayed to work 18-hour days in brutal heat, had bled and burned and pushed himself past exhaustion into something resembling madness. But he'd changed the war. One ridiculous idea at a time. One impossible modification. One grease-stained mechanic who saw aircraft not as they were, but as they could be. The transport banked east, toward home, toward a future where Jack Holloway would design 17 different aircraft and revolutionize naval aviation 3 times over. But none of it would ever feel as important as those 3 weeks in Hangar 7, with Sarah and Tom and Billy and even skeptical Frank, building something impossible because the alternative was surrender. Below, on the airfield, another flight of Hellcats scrambled for a combat patrol. Jack watched them climb, fast and deadly, dominating the sky that had once belonged to others. "Fly safe," he whispered, "and bring them all home." The transport climbed higher, the Pacific falling away beneath them, beautiful and treacherous and marked with the graves of so many who'd never made it home. But fewer graves now. Fewer letters to mothers. Fewer pilots falling from the sky like burning stars. Jack Holloway closed his eyes and let himself rest. The mathematics was sound. The modifications were proven. The war would continue, would demand more sacrifices, more innovations, more desperate measures. But today, in this moment, they were winning. And sometimes, when you're fighting for survival against impossible odds, winning is the only thing that matters. The engines hummed. The ocean passed beneath. And somewhere over that vast Pacific theater, modified Hellcats danced through hostile skies, turning inside zeros, hunting instead of running, proving that one man's ridiculous idea could change everything. They called him Ironmaster. They called him crazy. They called him the mechanic who won the Pacific. Jack Holloway called himself lucky. Lucky to have had the chance, the tools, the desperation, and the mathematics to make a difference when it mattered most. But luck, Jack would soon discover, had a darker side. And the mathematics that had saved so many lives was about to demand a terrible price. The transport touched down at Naval Air Engineering Center, Philadelphia, on a cold October morning. Jack stepped onto American soil for the first time in 18 months, and the ground felt wrong. Too solid, too safe, too far from the war that still burned across the Pacific. They gave him an office. A drafting table. A team of 12 engineers who looked at him like he was either a savior or a circus act. The brass wanted more miracles, lighter fighters, faster bombers, innovations that would end the war by Christmas. But Jack couldn't focus. His hands, so steady when covered in grease and working on engines, trembled when holding pencils. His mind, so sharp when solving immediate problems, scattered when confronted with theoretical designs. He'd sleep 4 hours and wake gasping, Dreaming of Hellcats falling from the sky with his modifications failing, pilots screaming his name as they burned. Holloway. Captain Richard Thornton appeared in his office doorway, his uniform decorated with enough ribbons to fill a drawer. I need your assessment of the new Corsair modifications by Friday. Jack looked at the blueprints spread across his desk, numbers swimming before his eyes. Yes, sir. You all right, son? You look like hell. Just adjusting, sir. Thornton didn't look convinced, but he left. Jack stared at the blueprints for another hour, made 3 calculations, and threw his pencil across the room in frustration. This wasn't him. This sanitized, theoretical work where mistakes were erased with rubber instead of paid for in blood. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. Jack was in the machine shop, trying to feel useful by actually building a prototype component, when the clerk found him. The yellow paper felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Widowmaker Squadron engaged superior forces, stop heavy losses, stop LTCD, or Hayes Kia stop modifications failed under sustained combat stress, stop 17 pilots lost stop. The shop fell away. Jack heard nothing but a high-pitched ringing, felt nothing but the telegram between his fingers. 17 pilots. Modifications failed. His modifications. His mathematics. His ridiculous idea that had seemed so perfect. Holloway. Someone was shaking his shoulder. Jack, what happened? He couldn't answer. Couldn't breathe. The numbers had been right. He'd checked them 1,000 times. But numbers didn't account for metal fatigue, for the accumulated stress of repeated combat, for the moment when physics stopped being theoretical and became a fireball at 20,000 feet. Jack walked out of the shop. Out of the building. Kept walking until he found himself at a bar 3 blocks from the base, sitting in a corner booth with a bottle of whiskey he didn't remember ordering. You look like someone died. The bartender was old, gray-haired, with eyes that had seen their share of grief. 17 someones. Jack poured another drink with shaking hands. Because of me. He drank until the bottle was empty and the bar was closing. Drank until the bartender called someone from the base to come collect him. Drank until he couldn't see Hayes's face anymore, couldn't hear the imagined screams of pilots falling. But morning came anyway, brutal and unforgiving. Jack woke in the bachelor officer's quarters with a headache that felt like divine punishment and a summons to Captain Thornton's office. Sit down, Holloway. Thornton's voice was granite. I received the after-action report from the Marianas. You want to tell me what the hell happened? Jack sat, his hands clasped between his knees like a schoolboy called to the principal. The modifications failed, sir. Metal fatigue in the structural components I'd lightened. After 3 months of sustained combat operations, the stress fractures compromised airframe integrity during high-G maneuvers. In English. I made them too light, sir. They broke. Thornton was quiet for a long moment. Hayes and his squadron accumulated over 200 combat hours on those aircraft. They flew missions that should have killed them a dozen times over. The modifications gave them 3 months they wouldn't have had otherwise. 17 men still died. Yes, they did. Thornton leaned forward. But 203 didn't. The kill ratio for modified Hellcats across the fleet is still 16-1. Your work has saved more pilots than any single advancement in this war. You understand that? Jack looked at his hands. Steady now, but stained with more than grease. I understand that I made a mistake that got people killed, sir. Then learn from it. Fix it. That's what engineers do. We iterate, we improve, we solve the next problem. Thornton slid a folder across the desk. New assignment. You're going back to the Pacific. Pearl Harbor. They're establishing a combat engineering unit. Mechanics and engineers working together, doing field modifications based on real-time combat data. They want you to lead it. Sir, That's not a request, Holloway. That's an order. You have 2 weeks to design reinforcement specifications for existing modified Hellcats and a training program for field engineers. Then your wheels up for Hawaii. Jack opened the folder, saw the requisition forms, the personnel assignments, the weight of responsibility that had just doubled. Yes, sir. He spent the next 2 weeks in a fugue state of work that made his time in Maui look leisurely. 18-hour days of calculations, stress analysis, metallurgical studies. He redesigned the armor removal specifications, added reinforcement struts, changed the modification protocol to include regular inspection intervals. Sarah sent a letter. It arrived 3 days before his departure, her handwriting slightly smudged as though she'd been crying when she wrote it. We heard about Hayes and the others. Tom and Billy are devastated. Frank keeps saying he knew it wouldn't work, but I saw him in the hangar last night, just sitting in one of the Hellcats, and I think he was praying. I don't blame you. None of us do. You gave us 3 months of hope, 3 months where our pilots came home. That matters. That will always matter. But I know you blame yourself. I know you're probably destroying yourself right now, working until you can't see straight, trying to fix what broke. That's who you are. You see problems and you solve them, and you don't forgive yourself for the ones you can't. So I'm telling you what Hayes would tell you if he could. Fix it. Make it better. Save the next 17. That's how you honor them. Not by stopping, but by continuing. We need you, Jeff. The pilots need you. The war needs you. Come back to us. And bring your numbers. Sir. Jack read the letter 3 times. Folded it carefully. Put it in his pocket where it stayed for the rest of the war. Pearl Harbor was controlled chaos. The Navy had transformed the devastation of December 7th into the largest military installation in the Pacific, dozens of airfields, hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, all orchestrated into a weapon pointed at Japan's heart. Jack's Combat Engineering Unit, officially designated CC-7, unofficially called Holloway's Hellraisers, occupied a converted warehouse near Hickam Field. 15 mechanics, 8 engineers, and a mandate to solve problems that couldn't wait for bureaucratic approval. Listen up. Jack stood before his new team on their first morning. These men and women pulled from every corner of the Pacific. I'm not going to lie to you. My last modification program worked brilliantly until it killed 17 pilots. Maybe you heard about that. Maybe that's why you're nervous. Uneasy shifting. Exchanged glances. Good. Be nervous. Be terrified of screwing up, because screwing up means our people die. But don't be so terrified that you stop innovating, because doing nothing also means our people die. Jack gestured to the workspace behind him. Tools, aircraft components, testing equipment. We're going to make mistakes, but we're going to learn from them faster than anyone else. Adapt faster, fix faster. Questions? A young engineer in the back raised his hand. Sir, how do we know when a modification is safe? We don't. Not completely. But we test, we calculate, we inspect, and we learn from every failure. Jack's voice was harder than he intended. And when we're wrong, we own it and we fix it immediately. Understood? Yes, sir. They worked like demons. Every combat report that came through was analyzed for aircraft performance issues. Every pilot who landed was interviewed about what worked and what didn't. Jack established a testing protocol that was 3 times more rigorous than the standard Navy procedures, and when engineers complained about the extra work, he showed them photos of Hayes' squadron. This is why, he said quietly. Every single time. The reinforcement modifications rolled out across the fleet over 6 weeks. Heavier, more expensive, more complicated, but structurally sound. Jack personally inspected the first 100 aircraft, his hands running over welds and rivets like a blind man reading Braille, feeling for flaws that instruments might miss. You're going to wear the metal smooth, said Lieutenant Commander Patricia Morrison, the logistics officer assigned to CEC-7. She was 35, sharp-minded, with a brother flying B-24s over the Philippines. Have you slept this week? Some. That's a lie. She handed him coffee that was mostly military-grade sludge. Captain's orders, you're taking tomorrow off. There's too much. There's always too much. That's war. Patricia's voice softened. But you're no good to anyone if you collapse. Trust your team. You trained them well. Jack wanted to argue. But he was so tired, and Patricia was right, his team was good. Sarah's training methods had taught him how to delegate, how to trust that other hands could do the work he'd once thought only he could manage. One day, he conceded. One day. And you're not spending it in the hangar. She dragged him to the beach, a small, restricted stretch where off-duty personnel could pretend they weren't preparing for invasion. Jack sat in the sand, watching waves roll in with the kind of relentless patience that only the ocean possessed. "My brother died in a modified B-17, Patricia said, sitting beside him. Engineer thought he'd found a way to increase payload capacity. Structural failure over Bremen. Crew of 10. Jack looked at her, this officer he'd worked beside for weeks without knowing. "I'm sorry. I was angry for months. Wanted to find that engineer, wanted to scream at him about calculations and safety margins and my brother's last radio transmission." Patricia picked up a handful of sand, let it slip through her fingers. "But then I realized he was trying to save lives too. Made a mistake, but he was trying. And my brother volunteered, knowing the risks. Knowing sometimes the metal breaks and the numbers lie and all your preparation doesn't matter. Does that make it easier? No. But it makes it possible to continue." She stood, brushing sand from her uniform. "Come on. I promised Captain Thornton I'd get you drunk and make you tell embarrassing stories. It's for morale." Jack almost smiled. "Whose morale?" "Mine mostly." They spent the evening at the officers' club, and Patricia was true to her word. 3 drinks in, she had Jack telling stories about the early days in Maui, about Frank's skepticism and Billy's enthusiasm and the time Tom accidentally installed an oil cooler backwards and they didn't discover it until the test flight ended with the pilot covered in hydraulic fluid. Other engineers joined them. Pilots stopping by to shake Jack's hand, to tell him about kills they'd made in modified Hellcats, to thank him for bringing them home. And slowly, gradually, Jack felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but permission to carry the weight without letting it crush him. "To Hayes," someone said, raising a glass. "To Hayes," the room echoed. Jack drank, and tasted salt that might have been the ocean or might have been tears. The war ground on. Jack's team solved problem after problem, engine cooling issues in tropical conditions, gun jamming at high altitude, canopy fogging during rapid descents. They developed field modification kits that could be installed in hours instead of days. They created testing protocols that other engineering units copied. But the real breakthrough came in March 1944, when a damaged Zero made an emergency landing on a remote atoll and was captured intact. "We need to fly it," Jack said the moment he saw the intelligence report. Captain Thornton looked at him like he'd suggested invading Tokyo personally. "Fly enemy aircraft? That's insane." "That's necessary. Every modification we've made is based on pilot reports and speculation about Zero performance characteristics. If we can actually fly one, test it against our own aircraft, we'll know exactly what we're dealing with. And if the pilot crashes? Then we pick someone expendable." Jack met his eyes. "Like me?" "Absolutely not. I'm the only person in this room who understands both aircraft engineering and has enough flight time to not kill myself in the first 30 seconds. Jack had logged 200 hours in various aircraft during testing, not enough to be a combat pilot, but enough to keep something in the air. "Sir, this is the opportunity we've been waiting for." Thornton argued for 3 days. But Jack wore him down with mathematics, projections, and the irrefutable logic that knowing your enemy's capabilities was worth the risk. Finally, grudgingly, Thornton approved. The Zero had been repaired by Japanese-speaking mechanics, its damage assessed and corrected. Jack stood before it in a hangar at Hickam Field, studying the lines that had killed so many Americans, the engineering philosophy that prioritized maneuverability over everything else. "It's beautiful," he admitted to Patricia, who'd volunteered to serve as ground coordinator. "Elegant. Every gram optimized for performance. It's also a death trap. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. One good burst and it's a fireball. Different philosophy. Speed and maneuverability as defense instead of armor." Jack climbed into the cockpit, his hands finding controls that felt alien and familiar simultaneously. "Let's see what you can do." The Zero's engine, a Nakajima Sake, sounded different from American radials. Higher-pitched, almost delicate. Jack taxied carefully, getting used to the lighter control response, the way the aircraft wanted to dance rather than lumber. Then he was airborne, and everything changed. The Zero didn't just fly. It floated, responding to control inputs like thought-made metal. Jack executed turns that would have made a Hellcat complain, and the Zero seemed to laugh. Climbed at angles that violated everything he knew about power-to-weight ratios. Rolled with a speed that was genuinely frightening. Jesus, he breathed into the radio. I understand now. Understand what? Patricia's voice, concerned. Why they've been winning. This isn't just a good aircraft. This is a philosophical statement about air combat. Jack pushed the Zero through another series of maneuvers, his engineer's mind cataloging every response, every characteristic. Everything we've been doing is right. We can't outturn them, so we use speed and durability. But now I know exactly how much we need to compensate. He flew for 40 minutes, pushing the Zero to its limits and then beyond, until the fuel gauge read dangerously low. Landing was delicate, the Zero's landing gear was fragile, and Jack could feel the airframe flex in ways that would terrify American pilots used to robust construction. But he got it down, rolled to a stop, and climbed out to find his entire team waiting. Well, Sarah had arrived from Maui 2 weeks prior, promoted to lead field mechanic. Was it worth the risk? Jack pulled out his notebook, already scribbling. We need to change everything. The reinforcement modifications are good, but we're still too heavy. I need to redesign the weight distribution, improve our roll rate by at least 20%, and develop new combat tactics based on what I just learned. Jack. Sarah grabbed his arm. Slow down. One thing at a time. We don't have time. The invasion of the Philippines is in 6 months. Every day we wait, more pilots die. But he forced himself to breathe, to focus. You're right. One thing at a time. Let's start with the roll rate. The next modification package, officially designated Pacific Enhancement Protocol Mark III, incorporated everything Jack had learned from flying the Zero. Not trying to match it, but to counter it. The Hellcats would never turn like Zeros, but they could roll faster, dive better, and use energy retention in ways that negated the Zero's advantages. It took 8 weeks to develop, test, and begin fleet-wide implementation. 8 weeks of 20-hour days, of calculations refined and refined again, of test flights that pushed pilots to their limits. And then came the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Jack wasn't there. He was at Pearl Harbor, monitoring reports, when the largest carrier battle of the war erupted. Hundreds of aircraft, the Japanese committing everything they had left, the Americans meeting them with overwhelming numbers and modified Hellcats. The radio reports came in fragments. Massive formations. Intense combat. Then, slowly, incredibly, the realization. The Americans were slaughtering them. The final tally was almost incomprehensible. The U.S. lost 29 aircraft. The Japanese lost over 600. They're calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Patricia said, reading the intelligence summary. Jack, do you understand what this means? You didn't just improve our aircraft. You helped break their naval air power. Jack sat in his office, staring at the numbers. 600 Japanese aircraft. How many pilots? How many engineers who'd built those Zeros? How many mothers would receive telegrams? This was necessary, he said quietly. Yes. It was. Hayes would have loved to see it. Yes. He would have. Patricia squeezed his shoulder. You honored him. You fixed what broke. You saved the next 17, and the 17 after that, and thousands more. That night, Jack wrote 17 letters. One to each family of the pilots killed in the Widowmaker squadron, telling them about modifications made in their sons' names, about victories won because of lessons learned, about how their losses had meaning beyond grief. He didn't know if that would help, but it was all he could offer. The war continued, but the shape had changed. American aircraft dominated the Pacific skies, pushing relentlessly toward Japan. Jack's team kept working. New modifications, new solutions, always another problem to solve. But in quiet moments, Jack returned to that beach where Patricia had told him about her brother. Sat in the sand and watched the waves and thought about physics and probability and the weight of being the person whose calculations determined who lived and who died. You did good, Ironmaster. Hayes's voice, in his memory. You brought us home. Not all of them. Never all of them. but more than would have made it without him. That had to be enough. Because the war demanded it. The numbers demanded it. And Jack Holloway, grease-stained mechanic turned combat engineer, would keep calculating, keep modifying, keep solving impossible problems until the last shot was fired. And then, maybe then he'd let himself rest. But not yet. Not while there was work to do. The telegram arrived on August 15, 1945. 2 words that changed everything: war over. Jack was in the machine shop, redesigning a fuel injection system that would never be needed, when Patricia found him. She didn't say anything, just handed him the paper and waited. He read it 3 times. War over. The words felt foreign, impossible, like a calculation that didn't balance. What do we do now? He asked, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears. Patricia smiled, and there were tears on her cheeks. We go home, Jack. We finally go home. The base erupted in celebration. Sailors dancing, pilots singing, officers breaking out forbidden whiskey. But Jack walked through it in a daze, unable to process that the thing defining every moment of the last 4 years had simply ended. No more combat reports. No more modifications. No more names written in grease pencil on his workshop wall. He found himself back at the beach as sunset painted the Pacific in impossible colors. The ocean looked the same as always, relentless, patient, indifferent to human wars. Somewhere out there, Zeros rusted in shallow graves. Hellcats too. And pilots who'd never see this piece. You're not celebrating. Sarah appeared beside him, 2 bottles of beer in her hands. She'd aged a decade in 4 years, they all had, but her eyes still held that sharpness that had made her the best mechanic he'd ever trained. Don't know how. Jack accepted the beer, stared at it. For 4 years, every calculation mattered. Every decision could save lives or cost them. And now we figure out who we are when we're not at war. Sarah clinked her bottle against his. To Hayes. To Michael. To everyone who didn't make it here. They drank in silence, watching waves roll in like they'd done throughout history, unconcerned with human conflicts or their resolutions. I got a letter from Tom, Sarah said eventually. He's going back to Detroit, wants to work for Ford. Says he's done with aircraft, wants to build something people can actually use for living instead of dying. Makes sense. Billy's staying in. Navy offered him a mechanical engineering scholarship, full ride. Kid who could barely read a schematic 4 years ago is going to be designing ships. She paused. What about you, Jack? What does the Ironmaster do when there's no more iron to master? Jack had been avoiding that question for weeks, since it became clear the war was ending. The Navy wanted him to stay, offered him promotions and positions and all the comfortable security of peacetime military service. But the thought of returning to theoretical work, of pushing paper instead of metal, made something in his chest constrict. I don't know, he admitted. I'm 32 years old and I've spent the most important years of my life building better ways to kill people. What's the civilian application for that? You built better ways to protect people, Sarah corrected. Huge difference. And the world's still full of problems that need solving, still full of impossible challenges that everyone says can't be done. She looked at him directly. Still needs people stubborn enough to prove them wrong. Before Jack could respond, a young ensign came running down the beach, waving frantically. Mr. Holloway. Sir, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Jack exchanged glances with Sarah, then followed the ensign back to the base. Outside the CC-7 hangar stood a man in civilian clothes, expensive suit, polished shoes, completely out of place among the military chaos. Jack Holloway? The man extended his hand. William Harrison, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. I've been trying to find you for 3 months. Jack shook his hand warily. Why? Because you revolutionized our aircraft design without permission, without oversight, and with modifications that our entire engineering department said were impossible. Harrison smiled. We want to hire you. Chief of Advanced Development. Name your salary. Jack blinked. The war just ended 6 hours ago. And the peace will need aircraft too. Commercial aviation is about to explode. Everything we learned about fighters, bombers, reconnaissance, It all translates to civilian applications. We need innovators, people who see beyond what is to what could be. Harrison pulled out a business card. Think about it. But don't think too long. Lockheed's probably trying to find you too. He left, and Jack stood holding the business card like it might detonate. Well, Sarah said, appearing at his shoulder. Looks like someone figured out what the Ironmaster does next. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He walked through the hangar one final time, running his hands over workbenches worn smooth by endless hours, tools he'd used so often they felt like extensions of his body. This space had been his cathedral, his proving ground, his penance and redemption. He found the wall where he'd kept his count, every modified aircraft, every successful mission, every pilot brought home. The numbers stretched from floor to ceiling, a mathematical prayer to survival. But he'd also kept another list, smaller, in the corner where nobody else looked. The failures. The losses. The times when mathematics wasn't enough. 17 names from Hayes' squadron. 8 others scattered across various incidents. 25 in total. 25 mistakes that no amount of success would ever erase. I remember them too. Patricia stood in the doorway, her uniform jacket unbuttoned for the first time since Jack had known her. Every single one. My brother's still on a list somewhere in Bremen, in an engineer's nightmares. How do you carry it? By remembering the ones who lived because of what we did. By knowing that perfect solutions don't exist in war, only better ones. She moved to stand beside him, studying the walls. You're thinking about Grumman's offer. How did you? Because Harrison visited me too. Wants me to run logistics for their new commercial division. Patricia smiled slightly. I said yes. Figured it was time to help build things that connect people instead of kill them. But I told them the offer's contingent on you signing first. Why? Because you're the best engineer I've ever met, and also the most broken. You need to prove that your skills can create instead of just modify. That the Ironmaster can build from zero instead of fixing what's already broken. Jack looked at the walls, at the numbers, at 4 years of desperate innovation compressed into mathematics and metal. Then he pulled out his grease pencil and wrote one final equation. Lives saved, lives lost equals continue. Okay, he said quietly. Let's build something new. 3 months later, Jack stood in Grumman's Advanced Development Facility in Bethpage, New York. The space was massive, clean, filled with the latest equipment and staffed by engineers who designed the aircraft he'd spent years modifying. They looked at him with a mixture of respect and resentment, the grease monkey who'd shown them up. Gentlemen. Jack stood before a blackboard covered in preliminary designs. We're going to build a passenger aircraft that can carry 100 people from New York to Los Angeles in 6 hours. Everyone says it's impossible. The engines don't exist. The materials aren't strong enough. The economics don't work. He picked up chalk, began writing equations. They said the same thing about making Hellcats outmaneuver Zeros. Let me show you the mathematics of impossible. The engineers leaned forward. And Jack Holloway, for the first time in 4 years, felt the weight lift just slightly. Not gone, it would never be gone, but balanced now by purpose that didn't require anyone's death to prove its worth. Outside, the autumn sun set over Long Island. And in hangars across the Pacific, mechanics were painting over combat tallies, replacing them with peacetime insignia. The war was over. The counting had stopped. But the work, the real work of building a better world from the ashes of the old one, was just beginning. And Jack Holloway had the numbers to prove it was possible.